1,000,000 lives lost in the desert, the farewell speech of a dying man, then battles, chaos, and coronations. This is God's big picture, the partial kingdom, place and king. In these studies, we're looking at the big picture of the Bible story. All the units can be downloaded for free, including printable outlines of the talks and the Bible studies at clayton.tv and godsbigpicture.co.uk. So where are we in the story so far? Well, after the fall, when human beings destroyed the perfect creation, God promised to put things right again. There are 4 main elements to this promise. In our last study, we looked at the Exodus, the giving of the law, and the building of the tabernacle. And we saw how they partially fulfilled God's first 2 promises, to raise up a people and to bless them. That took us to the end of Leviticus. Next up are God's other 2 promises, to give his people a place or land to live in, that's in Numbers to Joshua, and a king to rule over them, in Judges to Chronicles. So that's where we're going today. We're still in the partial kingdom, and we'll start with the promise of God's place. So let's remind ourselves of God's promise of a place or land way back in Genesis 12. Referring to Canaan, God said to Abraham, "To your offspring I will give this land." And Numbers to Joshua tells us how this great promise came true. So having received God's law in the thunder of Mount Sinai, the Israelites are now poised to set out on their journey to the Promised Land. But the book of Numbers is actually a record of disobedience and delay, a depressing tale. The Israelites start grumbling from the moment they set out. Even when scouts return from spying on Canaan and report that it's flowing with milk and honey, instead of being elated, the Israelites are terrified of those who live there and protest that they'd be better off back in Egypt. It's appalling ingratitude and unbelief. As a result, God decrees that all of that generation, except the faithful Caleb and Joshua, will die before they enter the land. This is a devastating punishment. Their journey shouldn't have lasted more than a few months, but it actually takes them 40 years. Next, the book of Deuteronomy contains both blessings and curses. It takes us right to the plains of Moab by the River Jordan, actually overlooking Canaan. The next generation is just about to enter the land, and Moses speaks to the people one last time before he dies. He pleads, "Don't make the same mistakes as us." And the stakes are high. On the one hand, if they obey, they'll be blessed. Moses says, "If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands that I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all nations on earth." But if they aren't faithful to God, he'll curse them. You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess. Then Moses dies, and he's succeeded by Joshua, and his book is one of conquest and uncertainty. It's under Joshua that the Israelites finally get to enter Canaan. God enables them miraculously to defeat the inhabitants and to take possession of this land for themselves. The writer comments, "The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled." God's kingdom has been established, at least in part. God's people are in God's place, under God's rule, and enjoying his blessing. Job done, we ask? But a note of caution is also struck as the book ends. Joshua preaches a heartfelt farewell sermon to the people before he dies, echoing Moses in Deuteronomy. He passionately urges them to fear God and obey his law. But he also warns them that if you turn away, the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. And worse still, he says, they'll be evicted from the land. So a big question mark hovers over the Israelites as they face the future. Will they keep the covenant and prosper, or will they disobey and be expelled? We turn now to the next promise of a king. We're in Judges to Chronicles. Abraham wasn't told that God's people would be ruled by a king, but it is stated elsewhere. God tells the snake in the Garden of Eden that one born of a woman will appear in the future who will crush his head and defeat him. And from that moment on, we're looking for the serpent crusher, wondering who this mighty figure will be, who God will raise up to destroy evil. We're given a clue later in Genesis, when Jacob blesses his son Judah, saying, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." That's saying that one of Judah's descendants will rule over all nations forever. And then just before the people enter the land, Moses gives them instructions about a future monarchy. The king is to rule under God, to be God's man, submitting to him and reading his law daily, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God. So the promise of a king is really a subset of the promise of God's rule and blessing. Blessing comes as God rules in his kingdom through his king. That's the promise. But how does it play out? Well, in the next few books of the Bible, we'll see once more only a partial fulfillment. In Judges, we see a cycle of sin and grace in the Promised Land. Joshua has just died, and the account of what follows makes depressing reading. The people don't heed the warnings of Moses and Joshua, but rebel against God's rule. The whole thing's a mess, and the same cycle is repeated again and again throughout the book. The Israelites sin and serve other gods. God judges them and allows their enemies to defeat them. In desperation, they then cry to him for mercy, and he responds by providing a judge, which is another word for ruler. God enables these judges to restore peace to the land. But it never lasts long. The people soon sin again, and the cycle repeats once more. The last words of the book point both to the problem and a possible solution. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. And we're left thinking, oh, if only they had a king. So on to 1 Samuel, which begins with a false start. You see, a few years later, the Israelites approach Samuel, the last judge, and they say, "Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." And God is angry with them for that request. Not because they want a king, but because of their motivation in asking for one. They want a king instead of God, as the surrounding nations had, rather than a king under God, such as the one Moses had envisioned in Deuteronomy 17. But despite the sinfulness of their request, God gives them what they asked for, and Saul is anointed as king. But he soon turns from the Lord and is rejected by him. Samuel then anoints the boy David, God's choice for king. This young lad goes on to defeat the giant Philistine Goliath single-handedly, and we see God's presence is with him. At that point, we're expecting David to be enthroned any moment. But Saul continues to reign and forces him to flee. Mysteriously, it's only after rejection and suffering that the Lord's anointed enters his glory. It will, of course, be the same for Jesus Christ 1,000 years later. Then in 2 Samuel, David comes to the throne after Saul dies and establishes a peace and prosperity such as Israel has never before enjoyed. But this is not the time of fulfillment. David isn't the serpent crusher or that great ruler from the tribe of Judah whom Jacob foretold. There's still one greater to come, as God makes clear to David through the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 7. The future of God's covenant promises depend on this coming king, who will be a descendant of David and also a son of God. God says, "I will be his father, and he shall be my son." Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Finally, we reach 1 Kings 1-11, Solomon and the Golden Age. At first, it seems as if David's son Solomon may be this king we're waiting for. Under him, the land enjoys peace and prosperity, and he builds a glorious temple that replaces the tabernacle to provide a permanent dwelling place for God. At its dedication, he prays, "Praise be to the Lord, who has given rest to his people, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses." This is as good as it gets in Israel's history. We're at the pinnacle. So if we take a look at our theme of the kingdom of God, the partial kingdom has been established. God's people, the Israelites, in God's place, Canaan, under God's rule, his law and his king, and enjoying God's blessing. But tragically, it doesn't last. Solomon himself turns from the Lord later on, and although God delays the judgment until after he dies, it's only a matter of time before the partial kingdom begins to disintegrate. It's all so sad, but it's not the end of the Bible's story. In fact, all we've learnt about today was only a model. The reality was still to come. Just think back to that model of an aeroplane you made as a child. It may have been very impressive, but it wasn't the real thing. It pointed to something bigger and better, the actual plane. Well, in a similar way, this partial kingdom is just a shadow. It points beyond itself to something far, far greater, Jesus Christ, and the perfect kingdom God will establish through him. But we're not there yet. Before we get to Jesus, we need the prophets to fill in the details of this coming king, which is exactly where we'll be going next time, in the prophesied kingdom.